Hey guys, welcome and welcome again to my channel. This is Jowins Fashion Ville. Today's illustration will be centered on how to cut and sew a one-sided shift dress with a turtleneck collar. So if you're new to my channel, please encourage the growth of the channel by clicking on the subscribe button and then on the notification bell as well to get notified whenever I upload new videos, okay? And then existing subscribers, you guys are the best. I really appreciate you guys for sticking with me all through. So let's get started, okay? So basically I'll be using my basic block, and I'll be dropping the link in my description box. You can check it out for those who are yet to learn how to draft a basic block, okay? Because it's really very important for every process, okay? That's the starting point. Okay, so the first thing I'll simply do is to use my tracing wheel to trace out the lines to the other side of the pattern paper. So I'll go ahead and trace out those lines right away. So have it at the back of your mind that you always need a tracing wheel for necklines with a symmetric pattern on pattern paper. After that, I simply went ahead to extend the shoulder slant by 3 inches and then half an inch seam allowance. And then I connected that point to the midpoint of my armhole curve. You can go ahead to connect it to the lower part of your armhole curve if you want it to be more elaborate, but I decided to connect it to the midpoint of the armhole curve. Then I simply went ahead to trace out the lines on the other side of the pattern paper by highlighting it with my marker pen. Then on the other side of the neckline that has no shoulder alteration, I simply came down by 2 inches and then I connected it to the lower parts of the armhole curve as shown here. Then I went ahead to add half an inch seam allowance on the neckline and the shoulder slant. So right here guys, as you can see, I'm cutting out the excess pattern paper, and then I'll simply go ahead to cut out the back pattern for this illustration. As we all know, the only difference between the back pattern and the front pattern is the zipper allowance, but basically what I did for the front pattern, I'll be applying the same process and procedure for the back pattern. So right now I'm extending the shoulder slant, and I'll simply go ahead to adjust the neckline, and then I'll cut out the excess pattern paper like I did for the front pattern. So after drafting the pattern, I basically went ahead to use this pattern to cut out the main fabric. As you can see, I'm securing it with a pin first. So I'll go ahead to cut out the pattern for the front and the back part of the dress as shown here. And I will also use the pattern to cut out the lining as well. So guys, please don't forget to notch the center point of the back part of the dress before cutting it out into 2 equal parts as shown here. So guys, what I simply did next was to place the lining and the main fabric right sides facing each other. Then I simply went ahead to close up the armhole and the sides for this dress. So I simply did this for the front part of the dress and the back pattern as well. Then I went ahead to turn it inside out, added my darts, and then I gave it a good press. I hope we all know how to add a dart to a dress. So as you can see, it's neatly ironed and it's looking really good from here. So for the lower part of the dress, I went ahead to place 2 pieces of fabric on fold. I'll be using one for the front part of the dress and the other one for the back part. And the difference between the front and the back is the zip allowance. So I simply went ahead to take the vertical measurement. The full length of the dress is 37 inches and the upper part is 17 inches. So the remaining for the lower part is 27 inches and the starting line is the waistline plus a 1-inch seam allowance. Okay, so below the waistline we have the hip line and the hemline. Okay, so from that point I mark the waistline and then the hip line and the hemline as well. So guys, thank you so much. If you have watched to this point, I really appreciate and I really urge you to watch to the end of this video. So if you're yet to subscribe, please don't forget to hit on that red subscribe button right in front of your screen. Okay, so what I simply did next was to also mark the hemline. As you can see, I'm creating a line for the hemline. Then I'll also go ahead to add a 2-inch seam allowance below the hemline. For the horizontal measurement, I simply went ahead to mark 1/4 of my waist circumference on my waistline plus 1-inch seam allowance. On the hip line, I marked 1/4 of my hip circumference plus 1-inch seam allowance. And then on the hemline, what I simply did here was to subtract 1.5 inches from the 1/4 of my waist circumference plus 1-inch seam allowance, and I simply went ahead to connect these 3 points together. So as you can see guys, we have a curve indicating the lower part of the human body. So if you have an elaborate curve based on your body measurement, you will have a wider pattern than this. So for this illustration, this is the body measurement we're making use of. Okay, so after drafting the pattern on your main fabric, you can simply go ahead to use the same pattern to cut out for your lining. But it's simply advisable you draft your pattern on your lining first and then go ahead and transfer on your main fabric. But for this illustration, we'll be using the main fabric and then transfer to the lining I've shown here. Then I'll simply go ahead to open up the back pattern so that we can insert our zip and the slit as well. And then you simply go ahead to reduce the length of the lining by 2 inches. This is another method of covering the raw edges. You reduce the length of the lining by 2 inches. You place the main fabric and the lining right sides facing each other. You cover the hem area, pull it up and then run your stitch on the sides. Okay, so other than the normal double fold for covering the raw edges, this is another method for covering the raw edges on the hemline. So this is what the lower part of the dress looks like after joining the main fabric to the lining. You notch the seam allowance, turn it inside out, and then you give it a very good press. So the next thing you simply do is to join the upper part to the lower part with the appropriate body measurement. And make sure you know the full length of the dress. The upper part for this illustration is 17, the lower part 20 inches. Okay, So after joining the upper part to the lower part, for the back panel, what I simply did is to join the two pieces together. So for the lower part, I went ahead to insert the slits, as we can see, and then for the zipper section, I ran a basting stitch, of which much later we get to find out why I did that. So I will kindly advise you watch till the end. So on that part, this particular part, I ran a basting stitch there for a particular reason, okay? So right here on this table, we have the right sides facing each other for this dress. So I'll simply go ahead to close the shoulder line. Okay, so I run a stitch there to close the shoulders. Then with the appropriate body measurements for the bust, the under bust, and the hip line, I'll go ahead to close the sides. Okay, so you basically use your measuring tape, take an appropriate measurement of your bust on that particular point where I'm touching. You go ahead to also take the measurement for your under bust, very important for fitting, and then the hip line as well, and then you run your stitch. Okay, so we'll do that and we'll get to see the result of the work done. So you can see the shoulder line or the shoulder area well covered. Well, I actually did this lining to lining, main fabric to main fabric, and you can see it's neatly covered. You go ahead, give it a good press, and the sides too, it's covered with the appropriate body measurements like we discussed earlier. Okay. So it's now time for us to insert the turtleneck collar. So what we'll simply take note of is the circumference of our neck, which is the neck width of 16 inches plus 2-inch seam allowance, and the band width or the band length of 1.5 inches plus half an inch seam allowance on the upper and the lower parts. As you can see, the seam allowance is well folded, and then you go ahead to place your band on fold. Okay, as you can see me do here. Okay, so before attaching the band, I went ahead to open up the temporary stitch, which I call the basting stitch, okay, to enable me insert the neckband properly. So after doing this, I simply went ahead to join the neckband to the neckline, okay. So as you can see, I secured it with a pin, and then I'll simply take this over to my sewing machine, and then I'll run a stitch. So basically I sandwiched the band between the fabric, or between the clothes, or between the neckline precisely, okay. So and then I secured it with. So divas, this is the final look of the dress, so fitted and so lovely, okay. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you all. See you guys in my next video. Bye and have a great time.